How's it going, everybody? I'm sorry that we canceled class today. I made this recording and a few other recordings to help you have a lesson today, even though we cannot meet via Zoom. I will send out an email with all of the files that we use in these recordings, so you can have all the files. The first thing we're going to talk about today is introductions and conclusions. It's time to start thinking about them. So introduction pieces. First thing, we want to make sure that we have a title. Title should be creative and reflect your thesis. The other important thing that is required for your essay number 2, you'll have more freedom in essay 3, but essay 2, we require a pathos story to draw the reader in. You'll have some choices with what type of pathos story and how to organize it. Draw the reader in. You can use the same pathos story in your introduction to conclusion, so long as the conclusion has fresh content. You can't just repeat the same pathos story. Again, you are allowed an optional personal pathos, and you can include that as well if you would like. Just remember that personal pathos does not satisfy the pathos requirement. We do need a pathos story from the internet, please. Another important thing to do in your introduction is define terms. We're going to be reading an example introduction together about eSports. He defines what a sport is and what video games are. Again, you want to be thinking about terms relevant to your topic. So some potential examples. If you're talking about diet, talking about vegan, vegetarian, and like a paleo diet, you want to define those terms. If you're talking about do video games cause violence, you want to define the difference between violence and aggression. If you're talking about decriminalization of drugs, we want to define what that means. Finally, things like Roe versus Wade or what climate change is. Again, we wanted to define those terms for the reader in your introduction. For this paper, we only have 2 choices, which either are a thesis and opposing view, and you want to include both in a single sentence in your introduction. So thesis and opposing view. Just come right out and say it simply in a sentence, whatever your argument is. Marijuana should be legal. We should decriminalize marijuana, whatever it is. You want to come right out and say it. The final thing you want to do is preview your claims to come as a list. You won't really be able to finish this part until the very, very end when you know all of your claims. This is often called a roadmap sentence because it provides a roadmap for the reader to know what's going to come next. So conclusion, we're doing pretty much the same exact things. Restate your thesis and opposing view. Thesis and opposing view. We need you to bring the story full circle with a positive pathos story. Positive finish here. Again, it can be the same pathos. Can be the same pathos from the introduction. Can be the same pathos from the intro, assuming that we have fresh content. So you can't just repeat what you said in the introduction. If you want to use the same pathos story, we need a couple, 2 to 3 sentences of new content. If the pathos story content, if the pathos story is too small to do that, we need a fresh pathos story. And again, remember, personal pathos is available. And again, it is optional. You do not have to include it if you don't want to. And please don't forget that personal pathos does not satisfy the pathos requirement. We do need you to include a pathos from the internet. The final thing to do with your conclusion is to have a roadmap sentence again. Roadmap review. Review your claims as a list. Your essay claims as a list. Okay, nice. Normally I would ask you if you have questions, but you can't respond. So we're going to move on and read a introduction conclusion example. This student's topic is about eSports and whether or not they should be considered a sport. So we have title, video games being considered as a sport. This is does not reflect the thesis, nor is it creative. So this title would need to be rewritten. In this case, the student is arguing that the esports should be considered a sport. So we want the title to reflect that, and then we want the student to get creative. Okay, so let's read the introduction and conclusion. Again, remember, we're thinking about, do we have a catchy pathos that's drawing the reader in? Do we have clear thesis, clear opposing view? Are there terms that need defining that are being defined? And finally, do we have a roadmap sentence that is previewing and then reviewing all of the claims to come? Okay, so let's read it together. Video games have become a very common pastime to new generations and have gradually made their way to the national competitive activity. A video game is defined as a game played by electronically manipulating images produced by a computer program on a television screen or other screen. So we get a good definition of a video game there. Whoops. That is what we wanted. Please note that when it comes to defining words based on the dictionary, your citation should actually be the word you cited in quotation marks. So in this case, it should be like this: video game in quotation marks like that. But whatever the term is, video game, sport, Roe versus Wade, if you're defining a specific word, we want the citation to be the word in quotation marks, as opposed to the dictionary that it came from. I want to make a note here that this person does define sport later in their paper, and one of the corrections for their draft was to move that definition to the introduction because it's really foundational to their argument. We need to know what a sport is as early as possible. Okay, let's keep reading. Many people in the world today call video games a sport, considering all the large events video gamers have for certain games, but at the same time, many people do not. So we're getting the thesis clearly there. Some people do consider video games a sport, and then we also get the opposing view here. But at the same time, many people do not. So that's the opposing view. So again, remember, for whatever your paper topic is, we want both to be clearly stated in a sentence, just like this. People that think video games should not be considered a national sport because these games do not fulfill the definition of a sport due to lack of physical activity. So they touch on it. And again, to repeat, they do define what a sport is later in their paper. But one of the things they would want to do is to move it up here. And when it comes to definition of sport, one of the big things is physical activity. And obviously, video games are lacking when it comes to that particular quality. Video games have evolved from walking down the street to playing Pac-Man at arcade to at home games and video game arenas where people compete for money. According to Julia Glum, an active writer on Money, one person who benefited from becoming a professional video game player is Tyler Ninja Blevins. Okay, so we're getting our pathos. They're about to talk about a specific video gamer that goes through it. We get a specific person. We get some ethos about the author here. So we have Julia Glum, an active writer on Money. This is good ethos, which is what we want. Remember, each time we are introduced to a source for the first time, we want a half a sentence of ethos about them. And remember, ethos is credibility. So what are their resume? What are their credentials? Why are we trusting this person? And we get a specific person. Okay. He was able to financially support himself by making nearly $10 million off of Fortnite. So Fortnite is a video game. Video games need to go into italics. This proves that being a professional esports player can be very profitable. So in this particular moment, the one correction that I would give him is we need a half a sentence comparing it to an actual sport. Or I shouldn't say actual sport, a traditional sport: football, hockey, baseball, basketball, whatever. Comparing that this amount of money is a large amount of money, and that is an argument for the sports. Notice we have a formatting issue here. We have a new paragraph where we don't mean to have one, so we want that ed to move up. And now we're about to get a block quote, and we'll talk about what that means. Ed Gold, a marketing director for State Farm, some good ethos about who he is, supports the idea that video games should be considered a sport. Gold explained that you take a major sports advertiser like State Farm that advertised in the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, college basketball, college football, and now this company, State Farm, has said, yes, we believe in esports. Did I think we'd ever sign an esports gamer? No, but a year and a half ago, there wasn't anything called Fortnite. So the argument is being made that the comparison is that State Farm advertises in sports and that they're now advertising in esports, and therefore esports should be considered a sport. We have something called a block quote here. A block quote is any quote that is 4 lines or longer. Again, so we notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice that we actually don't have quotes for the block quote. The quotes actually get removed. Instead, we get this indent for the whole paragraph. That means you press tab each time. Notice that we lose the quotes, and that the citation here, the period goes inside now where normally it goes outside. So again, these are shifting formatting rules when it comes to citing a block quote. In our class, you are allowed 1 block quote. Each additional block quote will lose you points. Having said that, if you do have 1 block quote that's 15 or 20 lines, you will lose more points than you would if it was a smaller block quote. If you're having multiple block quotes solutions, you can definitely break the quote into pieces. So long as the quotes pieces are 3 lines or lower, you won't be getting into block quote territory. Or you can paraphrase the whole thing. So you have sort of an option if you want to paraphrase part of it and sort of weave paraphrasing into the paragraph, or if you want to paraphrase the whole thing. But again, remember, you are allowed 1 block quote, and it's not, block quotes are optional. You don't have to have block quotes, but you are allowed to have 1. Okay, let's keep going. The growth of the trend in video games grew so much to a point where bigger companies started to realize it was a great market and investment, knowing that the world is becoming more advanced in technology. So that would be commentary discussion of this State Farm argument. This leads to the question of if video games should be considered a sport or not. As video games start to present similar qualities as traditional sports, become a realistic career path that can support people financially, fill out stadiums like traditional sports, and become more competitive, even though they are not as physical as traditional sports, they should be considered a sport. So again, notice we're repeating the thesis here, which is good. It's nice and clear. This is a roadmap of the things to come in this paper, and I'm going to create a separate recorded lesson of the paper itself where we talk about the 2 argument sides. But again, notice we have a list here. So it has similar qualities. It's becoming a career path like traditional sports. It fills out stadiums like traditional sports, and that it's competitive like traditional sports. And then we have the final piece, which is the opposing view, that even though it's not as physical, opposing view, that the opposing view is that it's not as physical, right? You're not going to get out of breath playing eSports. Okay, so let's do the conclusion. So again, conclusion, remember, you're doing all the same things, except you're not going to repeat your definitions of sports and esports or whatever terms you're defining. You don't want to use the same ones. But we do want to repeat the thesis and the opposing view in a single sentence. We do want pathos to bring conclusion to the paper. Again, you have an option to use the same pathos story you use in the introduction, so long as that pathos story has new content. You can't repeat the exact same things. And if you are repeating the exact same things, the solution is to find a new pathos story. Again, remember, you are allowed optional personal pathos, totally optional. You don't have to include it, but you can include it. It can act as your draw in or your positive finish at the end. Just remember that it doesn't satisfy the pathos requirement. You do need at least 1 pathos example from the internet. Let's read the conclusion. The hobby of video gaming can be turned into a professional sport, as proven by 26-year-old gamer named Clinton Fear Loomis, also known as Old Man Dota. So we're getting new pathos right off the bat here, which is just what we wanted. As stated by Vlad Savor, The Verge's resident Bulgarian headphone and mobile reviewer, and one of the original Baker's Dozen editorial staff that founded the site, we get excellent ethos about him. Lots and lots of good details about why he is qualified. I would definitely put a comma here instead of move that quotation. Not only did he receive a chronic arm injury, tennis elbow, from practicing video games, he became a pro gamer and was able to make gaming into a substantial career. So again, if we think back to some of the lists before, we have an argument here of a physical injury that definitely argues for the physical qualities of esports. And that it can be a substantial career, just like traditional sports. Notice that we're getting good citation here at the end of the sentence. Although esports lack cardiovascular activities, video games should nationally be considered a sport because even though it does not require a lot of physical activity, it consists of skill and coordination that most traditional sports need. So again, we talked about above the competitive nature and the skill. These are definitely arguments for esports being a sport. Video game competitions are similar to major traditional sports competitions like the Olympics, and they have the same competition styles, such as 1 versus 1, team versus team, etc. So again, we're getting a nice comparison. Esports games are filling out stadiums. This is an argument that they should be esports. We also get the comparison that they should be 1 versus 1 versus team versus team. Again, a correction or an addition that I would give this student here is an example of that. So tennis is definitely an example of a traditional sport that's 1v1. And maybe we talk about hockey or basketball as an example of a team versus team here. Again, a half a sentence there would solve this particular problem. Again, notice that we have a formatting issue. He accidentally pressed return, so we want to move that line up into alignment with the rest of the paragraph. Let's read the end here. It can also be a stable career for someone who needs to support themselves and or a family. In the wide scheme of things, it doesn't differ that much from traditional sports. So the one thing I would add here, the conclusion, is we could use a little bit clearer roadmap. They talk about it, but it's a little bit all over the place. Okay. So again, to go back to esports, back to the introduction to conclusion, just as to replay. You need to have a title, please. We want it to be creative and to reflect your thesis. You need, for this paper, Essay 2, you are required to have a pathos story to draw the reader in. Again, you are allowed personal pathos, but it's not required, it's optional, and you do need to have pathos from the internet to meet those requirements. You need to define your terms. What are the terms that you are defining, whatever they are. We have thesis and opposing view. Again, you want to make sure you state those in a single sentence in your introduction, both. And then you want to preview your claims to come as a list. And again, this will probably be the last thing that you do, because the last thing that you'll know is what your list of claims are at the end. Finally, to review conclusion, you're going to do a lot of the same things. Restate your thesis and opposing view. We need a positive finish, which in this case, you were required to use a pathos story from the internet. Again, optional personal pathos, but we do need pathos from the internet. And then finally, give us a roadmap sentence reviewing those pieces. Okay, that is our intro and conclusion lesson.